Now I've glued some of the bracing on, and this is what I call the first wave, or the first phase. I've glued on the finger braces, the sound hole braces, and the two lower face braces, sometimes called tone bars. And what I want to do is do a preliminary shaping of these struts before I glue the X brace on the upper face brace. And the reason for that is getting access really to these ends of the braces. Once this is in place, it's really impeding the chisel or the plane getting in. So I'm going to carve these first. Just going to clean these tops up. First thing I do is put a centre line on each brace. It's not measured, it's just done by eye. And the finger, these finger mix, they're really good. Reference for the offset. I do most of my brace carving with this. It's a paring chisel, and the paring chisel has a long blade, which means when you're getting at a low angle like this, the handle isn't getting in the way of the cut. So a paring chisel is a nice thing to use. This is a really nice Japanese one. You can also use the European type like that. That's got a very nice long thin blade. I have decided I like this wider blade. It's got a bit more weight and a bit more it cuts better. So I'm going to start off with a fine cut. You've got to be really careful about which way the grain wants to go. If you try and take off too much wood in one go, this is kind of cutting inwards, and if I'd taken a bigger chunk it would have gone over the centre line. So I maybe need to reverse here and go the other way, the other direction. And the wood I'm taking off at the moment is just the bare minimum. So I'll have the opportunity, when the X brace is cut, is glued on, I'll have the chance to come back and have another tweak on these braces. It needs cutting from the other direction. This one, looking at the grain, I suspect is the same. And when I'm doing this kind of cut, I'm holding the chisel a bit like a snooker cue. I'm kind of controlling the cutting end with this hand and pushing with the other hand, providing the actual power to cut. These braces are all Douglas fir, which has got quite a crispy sort of texture to it. It's almost like cutting a block of sugar or something. You can even hold the chisel in one hand like this and use it almost like a plane. once the triangulation is done, I can scallop the ends, and that'll give me the sort of minimum, or should I say the maximum amount of wood that's going to be on the braces. And once I've got the ends scalloped, and I can leave these braces until the X brace is glued on, and come back to do some finer shaping. Now these two braces, the sound hole braces, I want to keep them square where they notch under the upper face brace and the X's. So I'm not going to treat them quite the same as that. But what I can do to cut the weight down but maintain the strength is do some shaping of the cross section in between the ends, in between the notched, where they're notched under the brace. So at each end, before it comes to the notch, I'm just chiseling into the centre line, and I can take out that middle section. I'm just going to check the height of the ends of these braces. I'm looking for 6. I've got 6.5 on this one, so I'm going to take that a little bit lower. Because remember, from the middle this brace is getting lower, this X brace is getting lower and lower. So I want to make sure there's enough brace left above this soundboard brace when it's glued in place. I've now got all the braces glued on. I previously shaped the lower face braces, or tone bars, the finger braces and the sound hole braces, and I've now glued on the X brace and the upper face brace, both of which are notched over the sound hole braces. You can see the end sticking out there. So the first thing to do is to trim the length of each brace. And because I'm using laminated sides, and we're going to do a talk about laminated sides soon when I get to that bit, I have to remove the thickness of the side. I have to draw a line where the template crosses over the end of the brace, and then come in another 3.5 millimeters, which is the thickness of my laminated side. If this were a guitar with normal sides, that would be a figure of 2 millimeters. So what I'm going to do is square up using the end of the little rule as a square. I can square up from the line of the template, the outline of the guitar, or plantilla as it's sometimes called in Spanish. That's my line. And I'm now going to measure, for good measure, I'm going to go 4mm because the sides are going to be somewhere between two lots of 2mm or two lots of 1.8. So somewhere between 3.5 to 4mm. So it doesn't really matter if there's a half-mil gap. In fact, some would say it's a good thing because if the width of the soundboard shrinks here, the brace remains the same size because the grain is going along. The grain of the soundboard is across. So what can happen if the soundboard shrinks is that the ends of the brace can actually poke into the sides because relative to the soundboard they're sticking out. So to have a tiny gap is not a bad thing. It forms a kind of expansion joint to the side. So that's the line, and I'm going to cut that. Because as we're shaping the braces and tuning the soundboard, we want to remove all the wood that we know isn't going to be there. We know this wood isn't going to be there, whatever happens. And go carefully the last few strokes down to the soundboard, and then that can be prized off with a chisel. It's good to take it off in sections rather than try and do it all in one go, because sometimes that can pull a bit of spruce soundboard with it. I'm actually using Douglas fir for these braces, which is what I normally use, but most likely you'd be using spruce for the braces. And then the little bit will just pop off. That's it. And if you can finish it off with just a chop of a chisel, it saves sawing right down to the soundboard level. So I'm going to do that on the other 5 ends. Next step is to just rough down the X braces. We know that this is the highest point and they're going to kind of blend away to the ends. So with a block plane, I'm just going to rough off some of the wood we know we don't need. But this time it's very broad strokes, just getting rid of wood that we know is not going to be part of the final equation before we get into the fine detail of that. I think I'm going to jump the gun here and just scallop the ends down. Again, it's a matter of where you know absolutely what the height of the brace is going to be, and at the ends it wants to be down to about 2mm. And we want to get that wood off as quickly as possible, and chiselling it is the quickest way to get there. Okay, now I've got to this point, I'm going to take the soundboard off the Solera and work on a towel, because I'm going to have to be moving this around a lot and picking it up and listening to it a lot. So it's important not to scratch the soundboard or break it by forcing it flat when it wants to be curved. So this has got quite a bit of cushioning in it. First thing I'm going to do is just check the height of this cross, which should be 15 millimeters, and I think it's a little bit higher at the moment, so I want to start with that at the correct height. Yeah, it's reading 16.4 and this one is a little higher than this one. So first of all, I'm going to plane that down. When you use a plane, you've got to be careful that you don't catch the grain on this one and plane across it and damage it. So good to have the plane on a bit of a skew, so that if you do hit it, you're not going to be totally perpendicular to the grain. And of course both axes need to be exactly the same height at this point, so that later they can be capped. That's 15.7. I think for now I'm going to leave it there, because what I'm going to do is take these braces down in height from about there, and that will leave a little island so big, and then I can then sand that to finalise the height of it, but I can't sand it while it's part of this bigger flat plane. So really that's the next thing to do. I'm going to put a centre line on each X brace using my finger as a guide to the width, as a kind of gauge, like a marking gauge. That's my second finger. And then in the final shaping, the braces are going to be square, 20 millimeters either side of this junction, before they become gabled or pointed. So I'm going to measure 20 from the join, just put a mark there. And then with the chisel, at each mark, start carving in towards the gabled or V-shaped section. And the first part is to just make this scoop in from square to V-shaped into the centre line. Here the grain's going a little bit across, so I've got to be careful that I don't go across the centre line, because I'll then have to come back in this direction to meet that. And this is one reason why we've got this loose, not on a solera, so I can easily turn it round, so I can come back at this from the other direction. No, sorry, that's the wrong side. this goes in this direction. So you can begin to see how this flat section blends into the kind of V-shaped section that we're aiming for. So I'm going to do that now on the other three arms. Actually missed this one somehow. And this flat section is this squared section is necessary because we're going to glue a cap across there with another piece of spruce, and that will close this gap, and that can't happen if this were pointed all the way to the middle. And the purpose of that is we've got a halving joint here, which half of this brace is cut away underneath and half of this brace is cut away on top. Now this one that's closed and open underneath is closed by gluing it to the soundboard. This one is open. That means when you consider that the strength of a brace is largely due to its height. The height here, the strength of this bar at the moment is only as strong as half the height because of this cut. When we put the patch on, it's going to restore the stiffness by closing that gap, because the gap will then be a hole in the brace, more like you would get in a structural beam in a building. So that's one reason why we need this square to be flat. Now this section is going to involve me lifting the soundboard and tapping it, and you're probably not going to be able to see that, but hopefully you can hear something. So we'll see how that goes. I'm not sophisticated enough to have multiple camera angles at the moment. I'll have to get on to my film crew and see if that's something we can do in the future. Hey crew, yeah? Oh, I'm the crew. Yeah, okay. Right, so what I'm aiming for now is, first of all, to graduate these braces down rather than a sudden scallop. We know from the cube rule, whereby the height of the brace affects its stiffness far more than the width does, that a small change in height makes a big difference to the flexibility or stiffness of the brace. So when you put a scallop in, you're changing very quickly from a stiff brace at this point to something very flexible at the end. And I think it's generally a good principle to try and graduate that a bit more, so it's more of a taper. You've got the bridge here, so I don't really want to mess too much with this height, but from there onwards it can droop. You've got 3 braces here, 2 here, which is good for the asymmetry. This is good for the asymmetry. And what I'm also going to do is treat this leg of the X slightly differently to this one. Again, to make sure it doesn't resonate quite the same this side as this side. And to that end I might put a little scallop in here, whereas this will just be a straight taper. So let's start with this X. And again, using the block plane, from about the end of the bridge, I'm going to start planing that down. And really I want to remove this scallop so it just flows into that 2mm height at that point. And of course this makes the top of the brace flat again, so I am going to then re-triangulate it. So just have another listen. much you can see from this point of view, but you can hold the soundboard in different places on the edge. And because of the way it resonates, where there are different nodes, different still points in the resonance, it will behave differently depending where you're holding it. So we're trying to get a series of listens to get an overall impression of this, the way it's resonating. You can also tap in different places on the soundboard. Still quite a tight sound, and we haven't actually done very much yet. And now I'm going to put a little scallop in here, which means there'll be a peak around here. I'm going to come in a bit further with this scallop to start with, so that it's a more gradual scallop. As I say, a sudden scallop or a steep scallop represents a very sudden change in stiffness. And this scalloping process is a little bit akin to the way a xylophone bar is tuned. The material is removed from the back of the bar to find the right pitch, and whether you take it from the bottom of the scallop here or from here makes a difference. And of course, when you're doing this, you've got to chisel from both directions to the middle, otherwise you're going to run into the wrong kind of grain once you pass the centre. You've really got to be quite sensitive to the direction the grain wants to go in, and act accordingly with reversing the cut when you need to. Quite a scary thing to do, because of course these are structural members and you're kind of compromising the structural integrity of them. But remember that most of the force is going in this direction, the direction of the string pull from the bridge, and that's why I don't really want to interfere with this bit. And these will be just tapered, there won't be any scalloping here. The scalloping is behind the bridge, basically, where you want the soundboard to be a bit looser. Also, I don't think it's necessary to maintain the full height, the full 15mm height at this point. You can go a bit lower than that. So you can see this scallop on the end of the brace is becoming more gentle as I pull it back, pull the peak back. And then you can kind of smooth this quite a bit with sandpaper as we go, to blend the curves into each other. And soften that peak. I'm going to just triangulate this. Well, I'm going to have a listen first. I'm hearing a bit more openness now in the leveled out. But there's still quite a way to go. So I'm going to now, well, first of all, yeah, let's have a look at these two braces. I think what I'm going to do is do more of a smooth curve on this one where the peak is more or less in the centre. So I'm going to plane it into a bit of a parabolic shape. So basically the maximum stiffness will be on the centre line right behind the bridge. I can't get my plane in this way, so it's going to be a chisel job. Remember, a chisel is a very similar thing to a plane. It's just that in a plane it's controlled by being in a frame, in a holder. This blade is actually doing the same job with the bevel up that the blade in a block plane is doing. It's just a matter of controlling it. And I just want to check this height as well, because I'm looking for 12mm at this point. 12.5, that's fine. By the time that's sanded it can be down to 12. So now I'm going to triangulate, and of course as the brace gets lower, if you want to make a triangle section, the angle has to turn. Can you see how the chisel is kind of rolling over to accommodate that lower angle as the brace gets lower? And the reason for this triangulation really is just to remove weight that we don't need. We want the soundboard to be nice and light so it will respond quickly to whatever you do as a player. It's got to be light and responsive. If there's too much weight here, then it puts a kind of delay between striking the string and the soundboard acting, which will also increase the sustain, of course, so it's a balance. If it's really, really light, like a flamenco guitar or even a banjo, you're going to get a very quick rise to the note, but also a very short decay. So these are actually ways of determining what sound you want. If you want to know more about this method of tuning the soundboard, this is something that was pioneered by Dana Bourgeois, an American guitar maker, and I attended one of his demonstration lectures in Belgium one time, and he's got quite a few videos on YouTube of him doing this, and you may pick up a bit more detail, because he's done this a lot more than I have. He does the tuning of the tops on all the Bourgeois guitars, and they're turning out quite a lot of instruments. It's a workshop with maybe a dozen people in it, and he tunes all the tops, so he's doing this thousands of times a year. So check him out on YouTube. If the brace seems a little square at the bottom, you can actually take a bit more of its lower portions like that. And if you look at, I don't know if you can see the profile of that, but it's quite a nice smooth curve. And I'll smooth that out more with sanding. This is starting to open up. So let's have a look at the next brace, this one. And I think I'm going to just put a little scallop in the middle of this. Now, when you, if you look at the way that xylophone bars resonate, they resonate, you can come, if you measure the length and come a quarter of the length in from each end, those are nodal points, which means those points are not moving when it's resonating, and they're the best places to support the bar, to make it ring. So I'm going to look at, when I scallop this, what I want to do is put peaks in the bar at those quarters, The whole brace is 136 long, so half of that is 68, I think, and half of that is 34. So 34 and 102 will be the position of the peaks. And again, I'm doing this one peaked or scalloped in contrast to this one, just to make the two of them different. This is further away from the action where the bridge is, so it can be a bit looser at this point. This has a kind of structural function in stopping the bridge pulling up behind the bridge. This one less so. Okay, now let's have a look at the finger braces. At the moment, these are just scalloped at the ends and full height, all along between the scallops. So what I want to do on these three is make them more, we'll treat this as the high point at this end of the scallop, and then we'll taper down in this direction. It's alright. I'm going to trim these down. Now another tool in your armoury is the little thumb plane. It's quite a handy thing. This is a mighty small plane and it's quite useful for this kind of work. I don't think you have to be too precious about the exact layout of a bracing pattern or the way you sculpt it. You think of bracing as a way of distributing stiffness in the soundboard, and there are different ways to approach that, so there's no absolute. What matters is the overall way the soundboard works as a whole. After that I can feel this side loosening up a bit and I flex it. When we tap it, there is a kind of overall tone to the thing, but it's really more the pitches of the overtones we're listening for. We're getting more diverse. There are more different resonances coming into play. Sometimes when I'm doing this job, if I've had a guitar that I particularly like and was particularly successful, in my opinion, or I want to reproduce the sound of, I'll take a photo of that soundboard and try and shape the braces in a similar way. I actually have the photo on the bench next to me. What I mean is I'll have a photo of the soundboard of the previous guitar that I thought worked well, Now I can use it as a reference to work to. Now I'm going to have a go at sanding. Now I've got sanding this crossing point to make sure it's all level and smooth. I'm now going to taper these bars down to the ends, because you can think of all this as the resonant area, and therefore loosening these ends allows the upper part of the soundboard to move as well. On a classical guitar, you're pretty much cutting everything off at this point with the bar. On a steel string with an X brace, you're kind of opening up this part of the soundboard right up to here, and therefore by thinning these ends down, you're allowing the X to bounce a bit more. It's kind of taking the stresses of the string pull up these bars, so the ends can be very thin. We've only got a height of about 2mm here, and what I'm going to do then is kind of do a kind of curved taper, parabolic taper from this point to this point to here. Maybe this is the best tool for the job. Now at the end of this brace, you've got to remember it's coming into the side at a very diagonal angle, and if you look at the actual line of the side here and then come in, that's where the side comes to. You've then got another almost 10mm of, no, in this case more like, actually no, another 5mm or so of lining. You really want all this area to be flat for the lining to sit on, and at the moment it's still falling in this end area. So I'm going to pull the scallop back and just make sure that very end area is flat to receive the lining blocks. And then to kind of V this part of it. Turn around because of the grain direction. I'll do the same on this side. There is another thing you can do when you're assessing the soundboard, and that is to weigh it. I usually weigh my soundboards when I'm thicknessing them, and I have a target weight for each shape, which I think is quite a useful measure, because weight is kind of related to density. Well, it's directly related to density, which is also related to stiffness. And I write these weights down, and I tend to weigh them before and after bracing. In this model, if I look in my little book, my reference book, I made this model a while ago, and The top weight was 162 grams before bracing and 225 when I'd finished shaping the bracing. This one was 163, so I'm still looking for somewhere around 225. Nice hold where you can read the scale. That's 232, so it's still a little bit heavier than the previous time I did this. And looking at the shape of this, I've been looking at these X-brace legs. I think this could come a bit lower as it approaches the end. In other words, make this curve a bit steeper and perhaps take it back a bit further to this point. And again on this side, it could be a bit lower here and the peak could be a bit lower. So I'm going to work on that. Yeah, I'm just going to roll the plane back to the junction so there's a little bit more off here. And in effect make this flat scalloped area at the end of the brace a bit longer. I almost don't want any scallop here sort of leading into to this point. So just looking at that section now, I think that's a better shape. It's a much more gradual way into here, and it's loosening up this section by lowering it. I'm just going to triangulate that now, because it's carrying a little more weight than it needs to do. This is almost crystalline, which is interesting because the wood is 90 years old since it was cut down as a tree, and in that kind of time scale the resins in wood change from liquid to solid and become kind of crystalline. I wonder if that's part of what we're hearing here. More kind of crystalline structure to the wood. This is proper vintage wood. It's a bit special. It comes from a stock of doors that I have in Douglas fir, poached from neighbours and the like, with their permission of course. They're not all living in houses with no doors, but they didn't expect. So I think that's a better shape. Just have a quick listen to that. Right. I'm going to take a bit off the height of this. Roll this end down a bit into the scallop, and then make the scallop not rise up quite so much at this point. If you remember, I was saying that a scallop is a very sudden change in stiffness, and by lowering the peak we're making that change a bit more gentle. Right, I'm now going to go over some of this with some sandpaper, just to smooth the cuts and the curves. Sanding in here where I've done the scoop is a good idea, but also on tops of the braces it helps to smooth those transitions from the brace, from the peak into a scallop. But where these scallops start, I think it's nice to just round over that point. At the moment there's a point on here, and here I've rounded it over, which again just smooths the transition of stiffness from this very low point to this higher point here. 229. That's pretty close to what we want. Let's see if I can lose a little bit more weight somewhere. This brace is not quite as you can see, it's not quite a smooth taper. There's a slight high point here, which I'm going to remove. This is probably a job for the little fella. There's some real flex now in these outer wings of the soundboard, which is good. Because these braces are tapering down towards the ends, they're getting more and more flexible till there's barely any stiffening by the time you get to the end of those. So that's kind of opening up nicely. And even in this direction, where it's a lot stiffer along the grain, it's kind of opening up quite well. I might take a little more off this brace, particularly this point at this end is a long way from the bridge and it's close to the edge, so I really don't want quite that much stiffness, that near the edge and that far away from the bridge. So I'm going to knock that peak down a bit, and again that will stop it from being such a sudden scallop, such a sudden change in stiffness at this point. But remember, we divided this into 4, so I want to maintain the peak right in the middle of that. Just make this peak slightly more pointy. Go a little bit thinner in the middle. And also, again, a long way from the bridge and close to the edge. Here I think I can take a bit more height off that, so it flows into the, there's a bit more of a flow into the end. See, that's a bit more. I might take even more off just here. Let's do a big broad stroke. This is a bit like painting with broad brushes and fine brushes. I have to find the right tool for the job. .120 sandpaper, some fresh. Now this is 40mm waste pipe, which you would use for draining a sink or a bath or a shower. If you can pick up some of this, it makes a great round core for sanding. And where you've got these scallops at the end, you can really smooth out that curve using this method. I have a selection of different pieces of pipe of different diameters for this kind of work. You've got the scallop here, which can be made smooth. And as I'm going along, I'm spotting little things. So just found a bit of a lump there I want to get rid of. Slightly lumpy as it goes into the end scallop. And you notice the end scallop here is the same thickness as the bridge plate. So it's just kind of continuing that stiffness that the bridge plate is giving to the top. Always try and think about how the stiffness is being spread in the top. And of course this is imposing a lot of stiffness across the grain. And this is kind of picking up on that point and then taking it outwards.